I'm going to show you how I made these slippers. They're microwavable slippers, which means that right in the centre of them they have a little pouch with barley. I would suggest if you're going to pop these into the microwave, don't put them in for more than 10 seconds at a time because the barley heats up really, really quickly. And of course you don't have to use the barley in them if you don't want to. They're just a lovely pair of slippers that are actually made to measure. So this is how I made them. First thing I'm going to do is make a pattern for my slippers. So I've actually drawn around my foot so they're going to fit, and then the next thing to do is to draw an outline about 1/2 inch or 1 centimetre around the outside of that foot. But where you go around the toes, instead of following it exactly, make a curve so it's starting to look slipper shaped instead of foot shaped. Round to the heel and back up again, and then where the arch of your foot goes in, just draw a straight line down there. Oops. And cut that out. You only need to cut one because you're going to flip this over and mirror image it for the other foot. So again, just a nice curved line instead of a toe shaped line. That's it. I'm just going to cut that a little bit wider because I want a little bit close to the heel there, so it stays around about, the border stays about 1/2 inch from the outline of my foot. So that's the sole of my slipper. Then to make the top of my slipper, I need a piece of card which measures around about halfway across the foot. So that's where the top of my slipper is going to fit. That's it. So place that underneath the sole pattern and draw around it. And then to give the top of the slipper shape, measure 1 inch or about 2 centimetres from the edge of the top of the slipper here, and then the same distance on the other side. And I'll show you what happens with that in just a second. And then from that line I'm going to join it to the top of the curve on both sides. And cut that shape out. Now when the top of the pattern goes onto the base of the pattern, when the edges meet up, that's what's going to give the slipper dimension so you can actually get your foot inside there. Now I'll need to cut out from my fabric 2 pieces of this, and I'm going to cut them out singularly rather than folding the fabric over because I want to make sure that I get 2 pieces that way and then flip it over and 2 pieces the other way so that I've got my left and right feet. And I will need to cut 2 of the sole from fleece, and that's going to be what my foot sits on, and 2 of those from the lining so that that's on top of my foot and on top of my foot underneath the top. I need my fabric to go on the outside, I need some bias tape to match, and then some wadding, and this is just 1/4 inch natural wadding so it's nice and soft. What I've also done is to make 2 little pouches. This is just leftover fleecy fabric from another project, and I've made 2 pouches that measure, well, I measure them, oops, right way around, about 4.5 inches by 2.5 inches, and that for me is the perfect size to fit inside the small of my foot, or the arch of my foot. Inside here is barley. I haven't put a lot in, so it still sits quite flat, and that means that I can pop these in the microwave and warm them up so it warms up the slippers. Now for comfort, don't fill those too much, actually get a big bump in the sole of your foot. If you wanted to cut out another piece which is foot shaped as opposed to slipper shaped and make a pouch that fits across the whole of your foot, then do feel free to do so. It'll actually have to be slightly smaller, so use the outside as your cutting mark and then do your seam allowance of about 1/4 inch on the inside. This doesn't have to be neat and tidy, it doesn't have to be turned the right way around, because this is going to sit inside the layers of the sole, so you're not going to see them. And you'll need 2 of those. So I'm just going to cut out my fabric and then we'll carry on. So I've cut out my fabric. I'm going to save my pattern for another pair of slippers. And we'll start on the left foot. So these are both identical but mirror imaged. So for the top of my slipper, I've got my outer layer of fabric. The wadding goes in the centre and the fleece goes on the bottom. And then on the base of my slipper, my fleece goes on the top, wadding in the centre, and then fabric on the bottom facing downwards. The one thing I did with my fabric was to put some fusible stabiliser onto it, which is quite stiff, because this is quite a lightweight fabric and it would be floppy, so that gives it a bit of structure. If you're using a heavier weight of fabric, like a curtain weight of fabric, then that should be okay. So the first thing I'm going to do is to pop my barley right into the centre and flatten that out, then lay my wadding on top, fleece on top of that. I'll pop a few pins in there, a couple of pins, and then I'm going to use a long straight stitch to tack or to baste all the way around the edge to hold those 3 layers together. There will be bias tape all the way around, so these stitches don't have to be particularly neat. And what I will do also is to put a few hand stitches into the pouch where the barley is, just to stop that moving around. So about 1/8 of an inch or a couple of millimetres away from the edge. Remember, these stitches don't have to be perfect, and don't worry if some of the wadding or the fleece starts to move slightly, because it may stretch, because we're going to trim this back before I put the bias tape on anyway. I'm just trying to keep that flat as I go around the curve, because it does tend to get caught underneath the foot of your sewing machine a little bit. So I'm just flattening that out so it doesn't pucker. So again, just line those up as best I can. It is stretching a little bit, but that's fine. And remember, I'm sewing quite close to the edge, because this is just a securing stitch, it's just to hold all the layers together. You're not going to see it. So keeping it nice and flat. Don't push it underneath or pull it around the sewing machine, because that's when needles can get broken. And again, I'm just trying to keep this flat as it goes under the machine, particularly on the curve. One little bit more. No, we don't. And then of course you do this with the other foot as well. One little tuck, that's fine, you won't see that. Okay. So snip that away. Take your pins out, and then I'm just going to take some thread and by hand just put a few stitches that go through into that pouch where the barley is, just to secure that so it doesn't move around. One more knot. I'll snip that away. And then I'm just going to do the same on the opposite side of the pouch. To make it really secure, you could do that in all 4 corners if you wanted to, but for speed's sake we'll just put a couple of stitches in here. We'll use the same colour thread so that you don't see that. Just one more little knot. That's going. And snip where you lose threads. Then I'm going to move on to the top of my slipper. I'll just tidy those threads while I go. And I'm going to do the same thing. So fabric on the top, line that up with my wadding, that sits on top of my fleece. I will trim that back again afterwards, just make sure it's they all fit together. and then we'll sew straight across the top and all the way round. Again, as close as you can to the edge. About 2 centimetres or 1/8 of an inch will be alright. And this is another basting stitch just to secure all those 3 layers together. Doesn't matter if you miss a few bits, because those stitches won't be seen. Okay, so that's the top. Next thing I'm going to do is to pop some bias tape across the front. So that's how it's going to sit on top of my foot, and I need to neaten this edge with some bias tape. So I've got 1-inch bias tape. I like to cut it just a little bit larger so I can cut it down. And if you haven't applied bias tape before, this is it. It's cut on the bias, so it has a little bit of stretch even though it's a woven fabric. And the 2 sides are both folded and pressed inwards. What you need to do is to open those sides up. Whoops, open up. Lay that face down onto your project. Pin it if you like. And then to attach it, you sew across the pressed line just here. So I'll take the length of my stitch down a little bit. Right the way down that ironed line. Like so. And then you'll fold this back over the top of this part where you've just sewn, and fold over again onto the other side. And make sure when that's pulled over that it just covers the stitch line from the sewing that you've just done. And pin that if you like. Now to sew on the other side, I prefer to hand sew because I like hand sewing, but it also means the stitches will be practically invisible, so they won't show through to the right side. So what you'll do is to secure your thread at the end, just a few stitches that go over and over. I hope you can see what I'm doing with red on red. I'll try and explain if you can't. You take your needle into the fabric at the bottom, but don't go all the way through to the other side, and come out, and then slip your stitch underneath the very edge of the bias tape as close as you can get, and pull that through. That's why it's called a slip stitch. Your next stitch is going to be directly underneath, and just do the same. So not all the way through to the right side, out it comes, and slip through that bias tape. Your stitches should be around about 1/4 of an inch or about 4 millimeters apart to keep them nice and neat. Although, again, on this side of the slipper you're not going to see them. So this is a good practice run if you like. So I'll just carry on all the way across. You can machine stitch if you like, but what I would suggest if you want to machine stitch is to put the bias tape on the back of your fabric or the back of your project instead of the front like I just did, and then fold this side around to the right side of your fabric. So if this was the top and you're top stitching here, you can get a much neater line with your top stitching than if you were trying to line the stitches up by stitching from the back. So if you don't fancy hand sewing, that's the way to do it. And bias tape, called bias tape because it's cut on a 45-degree angle, so it has a little bit of give. So when you're going around curves, as you will be doing when we sew the sole to the top of this slipper, it's not going to pucker and it'll sit nice and flat when it's pressed. Okay, nearly there. And then again when I get to the end, just a couple of stitches over the top of each other to knot that so it doesn't come undone. Now I'll trim away any excess wadding that may have kind of moved as I've been sewing, and the end bits of that bias tape. So my fleece has moved a little bit here, look, so I'm just going to trim that back a little bit. And now we're going to put the top onto the bottom. So place it across so that the line's horizontal across the centre of your slipper, and pin the toe first of all. Like so. And then come around one side and just place the edges together and pin until you get to the very end here, and then join those two sides together, and the slipper will raise up in the centre, and we'll pop a pin in there. And then do the same on the other side. So the sides line up neatly, and there's the edge. And now you can see the shape of your slipper taking place. Before I put the bias tape all the way around though, I'm going to do another one of those long stitches on my sewing machine close to the edge, just to secure those pieces together. So just choosing a long stitch. And take it easy if you have used your interfacing, because there's quite a few layers of fabric for your needle to be going through here. If you wanted to use a stronger fabric, if you're using a fabric like denim for your slippers for instance, try and get hold of a denim needle. They're stronger than universal needles. So your machine will be fine with thicker fabrics, but it's your needle that will give way first. Okay. So now I'm going to take my pins out. And again, if there's any excess fabric, if anything's moved, like this has a little bit here, look, I'm just going to trim away that bit of fleece that's poking out. Cut off my threads. And then my bias tape is going to go all the way around the slipper. So I like to put my seams where there'll be less seams, so I'm going to put it inside, on the inside of the slipper, around about where the seam is there already, and just open up your bias tape and fold the end over before you start sewing, because that'll make a nice neat finish to the hemline, to the bias tape. So I'll start just away from the edge there so I don't have too big a lump of fabric where the seam closes, and pin if you wish. I'm just going to sew, and I'm going to sew that all the way around. So I put my shorter stitch on the machine, and again line up the edges of your bias tape with the edge of your fabric, needle down if you can, and sew around that seam, the folded line, the crease line on your bias tape. Now I was saying about the reason why bias tape's cut on the bias, so that it'll go around a curve. This is where it comes into its own, because as you pull this around, make sure that you don't get any puckering underneath the needle, but pull that out of the way, keeping those edges straight, and your bias tape will give. It'll stretch just a little bit, just enough to take it around the curve. And again, if it looks as though it's going to pucker up underneath the needle, stop and just pull that away. When you do stop, make sure your needle's down, because otherwise you pull your tape out of your work. So it doesn't matter if it gathers on this side, as long as where I'm actually sewing there aren't any creases. All the way around. So, careful when you go over these side seams, because again we're starting to get a lot of layers of fabric built up. So when you come to a really lumpy bit, just slow down and take it easy. and then around the toe. Like so. Pull those creases out of the way if you get them. Try and keep that as neat as you can. Sounds like my private jet's arrived, so I better hurry up. Now when you come back to the place where you started, remember I folded the edge of the bias tape over. I'm going to cut that off around about 1/4 of an inch or about 3 or 4 millimetres over the top of the join. And then when you come to sew, line up the 2 iron pieces and your stitch line should be perfect. So where you end meets up with where you started. Like that. So I'm left with this. Don't worry about it curling because you're going to press that in a minute. And then give your bias tape a bit of a stretch and fold that over around your slipper. It will give and it will stretch around there. That's what it's been designed for. Like so. And then I'm just going to hand stitch on the back. Again, try and make sure that that bias tape covers over the stitch line that you just made so it looks nice and neat, and I'll just carry on hand sewing that. So I've finished stitching all the way around the outside with my slip stitching. All I'm doing now is putting some blobs of silicone adhesive or silicone glue just in dots all over the sole. This takes about 24 hours to dry, and I think it's worth doing because it just makes the sole of your slipper that little bit more stable and secure. So I'm going to pop that on top of the radiator to dry, and I'm going to be wearing my lovely new slippers tomorrow. Just need to finish the other one now.